welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you are new. Today we are chatting the highs, lows and in-betweens of the 70th Sydney Film Festival. For those of you who are new, my name is Mackenzie and this is the Women's Direction, and prior to it being a YouTube channel, I was actually writing it as a blog, and we've been covering the Sydney Film Festival since like 2018, I think. So in 2019, I actually got to work with the European Film Promotion, which are the organisation that bring the Europe Voices of Women in Film program to the Sydney Film Festival every year. I got to pre-screen the films, interview some of the directors, and it was actually a pretty awesome experience all around. Since then, I've had various iterations of the Sydney Film Festival, one of which was actually completely online back in 2020. And yeah, some of my favourite films I've actually discovered from screenings at the Sydney Film Festival. And all of my previous Sydney Film Festival film reviews are up on the blog right now, so you can go over there and check them out. But on to 2023. It was the 70th edition of the Sydney Film Festival, which is pretty amazing. Now, it's not as big as Cannes or Sundance, but the Sydney Film Festival is a pretty crucial event, particularly for the Australian film industry. It provides a lot of networking opportunities for Australian professionals, plus publicity for locally made films, but there's also a wide selection of films from around the world. I often make a point of only seeing films directed by women at the festival, and this year was no exception. However, the Sydney Film Festival has a pretty good track record of keeping the directors of the film it selects at about a 50-50 gender split. In fact, this year they were spotlighting the work of director Jane Campion in particular, who, if you don't know, she is a New Zealand-Australian film director who most notably won Best Director at the Oscars in 2022 for Power of the Dog. The festival did a whole retrospective on her work, showing some of her older films along with newer stuff, and there was actually a one-on-one interview session with her, which I unfortunately missed out on tickets for because they sold out so damn fast. So I'll get to the reviews in a second, but just some generalities about the festival first. It was really great to see so many people out at cinema screenings again. I feel like in the last month in particular, I've actually heard quite a lot of people talk about seeing movies in the cinema and really enjoying that whole experience again. I don't know about you, but I can definitely feel a sense of tiredness with streaming services these days. There are just so many to choose from, and the content is spread so thin across all of these platforms that it's becoming really hard to stay on top of good content. And I think maybe after 3 years of sitting inside, people are actually keen to go out again and, you know, visit a cinema and see a movie instead of sitting at home and scrolling through a bajillion titles on the couch. I saw quite a few European films this year. As I mentioned, I often try and include quite a few films from the Europe Voices of Women in Film program, so this year was no different. And I definitely noticed a distinct style of European filmmaking versus the American and Australian films that I saw. European cinema definitely likes to take its time and holds on shots for way longer than you would expect, which is kind of a good challenge in this day and age where we have things like TikTok and attention spans are getting really, really short. Okay, I've waffled on long enough. Now on to the films. I'm going to try and do as spoiler-free as possible, but with some of the films it's kind of hard to talk about them without giving away certain aspects, so I think it's safe to say if you don't want a particular film spoiled for you, then just skip ahead to the next one that I'm talking about. All right, let's get into it. First up is Thunder, directed by Carmen Jacquier. This cinematic art film was Jacquier's debut feature and was shot in the Swiss Alps, providing an instantly aesthetic and beautiful backdrop to the film. In my first thoughts over on Instagram, I explained that the film was kind of more like an art piece than a story-based narrative film, which wasn't exactly my cup of tea, but I could definitely appreciate the visual mastery of it all. Set in a Swiss village in the early 1900s, Elizabeth, 17, returns home from the convent after learning about her sister Innocence's mysterious death. When she happens upon her sister's hidden diary, she discovers that faith and desire can sometimes be intertwined. The themes of religion and desire are explored boldly through the use of the explicit poetry of Innocence's diary, and yes, the irony of the name is not lost on the audience, plus the liberal use of intimate close-ups. Cinematographer Maureen Atlan captures this world of teenage sexual exploration through close-ups of lips, touch, skin, faces, but you never actually see any sexual acts occur on screen. There's an interesting use of light and shade throughout the film, and some of the darker scenes are so barely lit that you can only kind of just see what's happening on screen, which I guess is kind of a metaphor for the things bubbling up inside a previously chaste Elizabeth. For me, Thunder was a coming-of-age story told in an early 1900s sensibility. For example, during the film, one of Elizabeth's younger sisters gets her period for the first time and is sent to church to do Hail Marys to apologise for her sin. In the world of the film, puberty is seen as sinful, so of course these hormone changes that pique teenage interest in sexual desire is seen as sinful too. Yet showcasing desire as a religious experience with God and less as a sin through the experiences of both Elizabeth and her sister was definitely an interesting topic for a film. I suppose in this way it does work really well as an art piece, but like I said, it just wasn't really my cup of tea. I felt it laboured in pace a little bit at points, and Elizabeth's inner monologue got a little too philosophical for me, so I mean, it really just comes down to the type of films that I prefer watching. Overall, it was an interesting and visually stunning experience of a film, and whilst I probably wouldn't seek it out again, I can certainly appreciate the intellectual challenge much more in retrospect. Band directed by Alfred Arnolfsdotter is a completely different tone to Thunder, and yet still functions like a bit of an art piece. Where if Thunder was a classical Renaissance painting, Band is a 1960s pop art installation. Band is a documentary that follows a three-piece post-performance band in their last-ditch effort to make it big. Performing in small venues to dwindling crowds, their music is an experimental techno and their performances are an art form in and of themselves. Confusingly, the film is actually a documentary, yet it's filmed quite like a fictional narrative piece, and in fact, if the director hadn't actually been there to confirm that what we were seeing was real afterwards, I still probably would have been questioning the reality of what I saw. Director Alfred in the Q&A actually explained that the reason why the film sort of feels like this is because as things occurred in real life, they would either go back and redo something for the cameras to either get it at a better angle or get better sound. So things were happening in real life, but it was very much a curated sense of reality, which explains the tone of the film overall. There are so many moments of relatability in this film for anyone who's an artist in any capacity, with themes of stability versus creativity, motherhood, feminism, your identity as an artist. There's a moment in the film on their journey to make it big where the post-performance blues band seeks out the help of a male producer to increase the quality of their music to make it big. And this brings into question a whole bunch of things about the identity of the band. Being previously an all-female group, it really starts to make them question who they are as a band and what kind of message they really want to put out there into the world. In a Q&A after the film, director Alfred, who was actually a member of the band as well, spoke about how she received lots of funding to make the documentary about the band, but they hadn't received any money for the band, which was an interesting commentary in and of itself. Band is a documentary unlike anything I've ever seen before, and if it's playing somewhere near you, I would highly recommend you go and check it out. It's very quirky and has such a unique feeling and tone, plus it says so much about what it's like being a female artist in the world today. Marlene Shoi's The Quiet Migration is an exploration of the inner struggles of dislocation experienced by Carl, a Korean adoptee living in Denmark, through the metaphoric use of a space rock that lands suddenly from the sky in the opening shot of the film. Carl has grown up with his Danish parents, learning how to run their dairy farm to one day take it over. But now old enough to start questioning what he wants for himself, Carl realizes how different he is to everyone else and begins to experience an identity crisis that slowly disintegrates his relationship with his adopted mother and father. Now, if Thunder wasn't afraid of close-ups, The Quiet Migration is certainly not afraid of a wide shot. The pastoral landscape giving way for many a wide pan, yet One thing I did notice about the panning in this film was that it always tracked right to left, going backwards. That is, until the very last shot of the film, where the pan actually tracks left to right, moving forward, perhaps in fact signaling a change of perspective. The use of symmetry in some of the framing is really interesting, and there's tons of those characteristically European held wides where an entire scene takes place in a single frame. Now, there are a few things that clash within this film. Its tone, its genre, its soundtrack, and the cultures of the characters in the film. At first, this clashing of tones was a little jarring for me, and it kind of left me wondering whether I'd actually enjoyed what I'd just watched, but then I realized that the film itself was actually a representation of the feelings experienced by Carl, and ultimately by director Marlene Choi, who has created a film about her own life. It was really interesting after the film to hear audience members debating the significance of the space rock. It's a very unique inclusion and definitely gives the film a lot of leeway for interpretation, which I really liked. Overall, The Quiet Migration was a simple yet effective film that explored this concept of dislocation and identity in a way that most audiences would be able to connect with. Now, I don't mean to hype this film up more than people already are, but I would be lying if I didn't say that this wasn't my favourite film from the festival, by far. Charming, beautifully written, expertly acted, and shot so effortlessly yet with so much thought, Past Lives is a masterpiece in many ways. Nora and Haesung are two deeply connected childhood friends that are rest apart when Nora's family emigrates from South Korea. Decades later, they reunite in New York for a fateful week as they confront destiny, love, and the choices that make a life. Now, the story had all of the elements that could fall into romance cliché, yet the story is so mature and has such a realistic depiction of love and relationships. The characters were believable, and in particular Nora, who was such a strong, independent-thinking, empowered woman who really didn't let herself be influenced by the wants of others at all. I was chatting with my partner after the film, and we were saying, in relation to my recent video on the Bechdel test, that this film wouldn't have actually passed, even though Nora was such a strong female character. And it got us into a bit of a discussion on how the Bechdel test really cancels out any film where a relationship between a man and a woman is being explored. But anyways, if you want to hear all my thoughts about the Bechdel test, you can just go and watch that video. Past Lives was a perfect dive into the love at first sight cliché, and really turned it on its head in such a pragmatic and relatable way for modern audiences. I also really loved the use of windows and reflections in the cinematography, which represented for me the distance that exists within Nora and Haesung's relationship. They can see each other on the other side of the glass, yet they're never really able to touch. They can be part of each other's lives, but maybe just not in the way that they originally wanted. I would so highly recommend everybody go and check out this film. Director Celine Song has created such a realistic and modern take on love and relationships that I think everybody really needs to see. Next up is Family Time, directed by Tia Kuva. Set in the wintry rural landscape of Finland, Family Time follows an annual Christmas get-together where the usual tensions rise and the event slowly falls into disarray. Using single locked-off shots really allows the strength of the film to shine, which is its layering of activity. Conversations happen on and off screen, family members come and go in the foreground and the background, and there's so much going on that you don't even really know what to focus on. There's so much happening at any one moment that it really brings in that feeling of chaos that family gatherings often have. I really need to take my hat off to the actors in this film because scenes were single locked off takes for about 10 to 20 minutes at a time, and the conversation just flowed so naturally. It was never stilted or laborious, and for all intents and purposes, you could really believe that you're watching a real family. The dialogue is written in a way that really focuses on the subtext. Most of the conversations are polite small talk and just general things about family life, yet you really get to learn a lot about the relationships from what's not said. My only criticism here of Family Time would be that after the Christmas gathering, which finishes about halfway through the film, my interest really started to back off. We leave the claustrophobic confines of the Christmas cabin and head back to everybody's day-to-day lives. Whilst this does give us a look into the family dynamics that each family has separate from one another, it does slow down the pace of the film quite a lot. I think this is because Family Time is actually an extension of a short film that Tia Kova directed back in 2018. So all those extra bits after the Christmas gathering just kind of feel tacked on to pad out the runtime to 2 hours. I felt like some of these moments probably could have been shaved down and maybe even cut half an hour off the total runtime. Now, surprisingly, this film made me contemplate my own mortality, which I'm not sure was the intention of the film, but it was definitely a feeling that occurred when I was watching it. I think because I was watching the family life play out on screen, it started to make me think about my own life and my own family, and that we really don't have as much time here on this earth as we think we do. Chaotic, messy, and a little bit long, Family Time was still a great experience, and I'm glad I went to see it at Sydney Film Festival. So because it wasn't technically directed by a woman, I did just want to do a little mini shout out to Shortcomings, which was Randall Park's directorial debut. A comedy set in America, it had a lot of commentary about the state of Asian representation in Western cinema. The film had a very unlikable main protagonist, but I think it was done really well because you could see the flaws within yourself reflected in the character, even though you could recognize that you didn't like him or what he was doing at all. I'd heard mixed things about Shortcomings, but I actually had a really good time with it, and I think it explored a lot of topics, you know, in terms of representation, race, even LGBT things was in there. It explored these issues in a way that was less shoving it down your throat and more like teetering on the line of what you can and can't say about these things, but it never felt uncomfortable or, you know, self-important or anything like that. But yeah, I would recommend checking it out for yourself, making up your own mind. It was a good time and definitely better to watch with friends, I think. Alright, and that brings us to the very last film I saw at Sydney Film Festival, which was Bad Behaviour, directed by Alice Englert. I was excited about this one when I read the description on the Sydney Film Festival website. It pitched itself as a black comedy exploring the mother-daughter dynamic and set in New Zealand, and I definitely love a New Zealand style of comedy, so I was really curious to see what this film had in store for us. Alice Englert wrote it, directed it, and starred in it. Whilst it started out with a strong, cynical tone, those dark comedic elements, and an interesting premise, it soon lost a lot of momentum for me, and by the end of it I was wondering why the film was still going, as it appeared to have run out of things to say. The film mainly follows Lucy as she attempts to seek enlightenment at a silent retreat with spiritual leader Elon. Whilst there, she also deals with the turbulent relationship she has with her stunt performer daughter, Dylan. Pitched as an exploration of the mother-daughter dynamic, I think a fault of the film is that it actually includes both mother and daughter without giving equal weight to both of their experiences. The film feels very heavily focused on the mother Lucy's experiences, which kind of makes any moments that we spend with Dylan feel pointless, as they don't lead to anything or add anything to the moment where they're eventually brought together. I felt the script was overwritten at times, and it would constantly retread ground that had already been covered. Plus, I found some of the retreat scenes to be a little bit wanky, which I thought was part of the comedy at first, but then as the film progressed, I realized that maybe it was the director trying to say something profound. A lot of the scattered energy of the film made a lot more sense when there was a Q&A with director Alice Englert after the screening. And speaking of the Q&A, I did tease a spicy question on my Instagram stories directly after the screening, so let's get into it. Now, there were two brave filmmakers sitting pretty much in the front row who piped up and asked a question, starting with what they described as the elephant in the room. Now, if you're not aware, Alice Englert is actually Jane Campion's daughter, and considering Sydney Film Festival was celebrating Campion's work this year, the two girls insinuated that perhaps Bad Behaviour's presence at the festival might have had something to do with that. As the two women asking the question were finishing film school, they wanted to know if they had any hope to even make it in the industry, considering they had no film connections. Now, Alice got a little heated at this and expressed that she's had to deal with comparison for most of her life, and that no matter who you are, you're going to be dealing with shitty people in the industry. Then she switched to a kind of motivational speech, which ended with a round of applause from the audience. I don't think the women really got the answer that they were looking for, but it did bring up an interesting point of discussion around the women support women movement. How do we navigate the competition of the industry and its who you know structure? It's a topic for an entire video in and of itself, but I just thought it was so interesting to hear the audible gasp from the audience when these women asked this question. And it just kind of highlighted to me the high and mighty attitude that the industry can sometimes have of itself. Also, that kind of disparity between film viewers or film appreciators, critics, and filmmakers. Anyways, let me know if you want a full video delving into the attitudes of the industry. So yes, overall, Bad Behaviour was a little bit of a mess. But I think, you know, the performances of Jennifer Connelly and Alice Englert were really, really good. I just think that its message and its point kind of got lost in the writing, and what we ended up with was a bit of an unbalanced mess. So that was all the films I saw at the 70th Sydney Film Festival. If you went along, let me know in the comments which films you saw, or if I've piqued your interest to see any of the films that I've spoken about in this video. Also let me know. We've got way more content coming. I'm literally about to go into an interview with our next guest for the How to Make a Movie series. It's gonna be all about script writing, so if you've got any burning questions about scriptwriting, that's coming next month. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, and if you liked this video, give it a good old thumbs up. As I mention at the end of every video, we have so much content over at thewomensdirection.com. We've got all of our reviews from previous Sydney film festivals, we've got reviews of other films, we've got information about female filmmakers that you may not have heard of yet, plus heaps of tips and tricks if you are a new filmmaker yourself. So head on over there and have a read. So much information, I'm not even kidding. Alright, I'll see you in the next one. Bye! So I'm gonna get to the reviews in a second, but just some generalities. Some generalities. In my thirst thoughts, I was excited about this one when I read the description on the Sydney Film Festival website. Nora and Hae Sung, two deeply connected childhood friends, experienced by Carl, a Korean adoptee, through the use of a space rock.